Good afternoon and good morning to those of you from different regions. Welcome to this, the first in a series of educational FIXinars that will be running through the summer up until the EMEA Trading Conference on September the 18th. This year the conference is going virtual and going global. Today we're delighted to introduce two of the longest standing architects of the FIX protocol, Jim Northey and Don Mendelsohn. Today they'll be giving a short introduction to FIX Orchestra, the latest standard to join the existing FIX family of standards. FIX Orchestra has become a game changer for all users of the FIX protocol and brings the usage of the protocol into the next generation of standards. FIX Orchestra has something for everyone, regardless of the status of your development cycle. And finally, before I hand over to Jim and Don, I'd just like to run a quick poll so we can understand how much is understood about FIX Orchestra today. I'll give you a chance to fill that in. Just a few housekeeping points. If you would like to ask a question after the initial presentation, please raise your hand and we will unmute you and invite you to ask your question. Or if you have a question that you would rather not ask in person, please put it in the Q&A box and I will ask it on your behalf. So can we take a look at the results? Great. And with that, I will hand over to Jim and to Don.
Thank you, Maria. Don, I think in their introduction, Maria might have just said that we're very old, actually, in a polite way. We're long-standing. So one thing I was very pleased to see, Don, and I'm sure you're going to be happy about that too, is the number of people who had already heard of FIX Orchestra was about 2/3. So that's a bit more than I expected. Before we take a look at Orchestra a bit more in depth, I wanted to just talk about some of the assumptions that we made as we were developing Orchestra. And I think one of the key things is that we're not seeing a great deal of major investment in FIX infrastructure. So we're now past the 25th year of FIX adoption. So when we talk about FIX, we really are not seeing large-scale investment in FIX infrastructure. So when you talk about people trying to address operational inefficiencies or improve the overall FIX ecosystem, you hear things about everything seems to need to have a day one payoff. So when people talk about making FIX more efficient, they usually talk about server consolidation. They usually talk about eliminating connections, those type of things, as opposed to any major changes. So when we approached trying to address some of the operational inefficiencies that remained with FIX for these past 2.5 decades, we believe that any automations has to be very tactical and incremental. In addition, even though we're constrained, it still has to meet some of the key operational challenges. From simple things, when we've been out talking to major cell sites, we got this comment, if you could just tell us which ATDL file was associated with FIX session, that would be great. And then things such as certificate deployment issues between larger firms and hubs, normalization, onboarding, those are the things we hear about as the big challenges. And we also realized, and this is an important point, that if anybody is going to do work in terms of further automating the messaging protocols around finance, whatever they do and invest in, it has to work for not only FIX, but it also has to work for non-FIX protocols. We now have multiple encodings in FIX. There's JSON, there's always been FIXML for the past couple decades, but then we also have simple binary encoding. We have Google protocol buffers. And so we now have a high-performance FIX session layer, which we're starting to see some of the major derivatives exchanges start to look at adopting FIXP, our high-performance session layer, with not only for market data, but also for order routing. And then, of course, with the chasing latency, we saw an explosion of proprietary binary interfaces from the venues when we went through that whole push through HFT. So that's the environment we came into.
However, despite this background of our business environment, we still have unmet needs. So we have our poor guys spinning plates. And Jim and I are old guys, so we remember this act where the guy had these long, slender poles and spinning plates and keeping many in the air at the same time. We were wondering if people who didn't remember that act would know what this picture meant. But at any rate, we have operational inefficiencies. Despite having insufficient resources to improve upon them, we just keep going on from day to day. And that leads to operational risks. Things work fine until one day they don't. And we don't have the time when we're putting out fires to improve upon our system in any major way. It takes way too long to onboard trading partners. There's still too much back and forth on emails and sending PDFs and Word documents around that somebody has to read and interpret, and too many steps to get there. In terms of just the messaging itself, there's translation that needs to go on, and we'll go into a bit more depth on that, but FIX is a kind of loosely defined protocol to begin with. You would like to have sort of a normalized model of the data internally, but you have to speak so many different flavors of FIX and other protocols, and you need to translate between them.
And so we've identified, the following pain points. We start off with the ambiguity and the incompleteness of the rules of engagement documents people prepare now. If you think even in the simplest FIX 4.2 order scenario, given the complexity of smart order routers and multiple order management systems that flow through and touch an order, even just our basic case of just sending in a new order single is for the same type of error, let's say, from one venue, you could get a session level reject. From another one, you could get a business message reject. Or from a third, you can get an execution report. And many rules of engagement just say, here's our execution report. Well, seeing all the fields available in an execution report isn't all that helpful or usable for them, because really the execution report is really more like 12 messages in what we call a scenario. The other thing we face with is that if you're on the sell side, you may be constrained as to what you can accept in terms of FIX session, because you're likely going to be hooking up to a commercial buy-side OMS vendor who will basically tell you that's our FIX session. So we go through this process of normalization. You have to go through a process of certification. And then once you get through all that maze, then you have to actually provision the connection. And we've heard from many people, one of the most difficult parts is just to get all of the network ports opened up, get everything set up, and get deployment working on. So not only do you have to deal with FIX, internally, many sophisticated players have moved to where they use some high-speed internal messaging bus and some normalized version of FIX, which they bring anything into, and just being able to manage that overall flow of how an order flows through the system. And then you add on to that now that both regulators and the buy side are demanding to know exactly where that order is going, where are the zero routes and those types of things. And on the backside of that, you're going out to multiple venue gateways with all kinds of different flavors of FIX, and then also all the binary protocols that are going on. So we sort of want to give a little bit of a walkthrough on a typical scenario, as Don, to go through what we normally do today without something like Orchestra.
All right. So this is the flow, if you can represent it as a flow of how we engage with the counterparty without Orchestra. So we have some documents typically that are message specifications, and we may exchange documents on that. Now, somebody's got to read those, interpret them, and in text narratives, there's always ambiguities or incompleteness, and we have to identify differences and gaps and try and figure it out. Another thing that's exchanged is a network specification. So where do you connect to, host and port? And there may be security information involved in that, and keys and so forth. And that's other information that's exchanged. And how is this information all used? Well, in terms of the message specifications, you have to determine if your FIX engine can speak that sort of dialect of FIX. And if not, then you have to make some changes into the message definitions and feed that into a data dictionary in your FIX engine. And then the network specifications need to be turned into session configuration in your FIX engine. And there's a lot of steps in all of this, and a lot of manual steps typically. And then once you have all of that, you need to test it out. And typically, because of incompleteness and gaps in the documentation, you discovered unexpected behavior as you're testing. And then this becomes really an iterative process of going around until you get something that you seem to think is right. And then do you have a proper test environment to determine that? And if not, you may not discover some unexpected behavior until you get into production, and then you've got some money on the line.
So to quote one of our leaders and one of the people who had a lot of the thought leadership on this is John Green. And in short, the information we have is sparse and not directly actionable, not to mention error prone as well. And, the windows of opportunity, what we like to talk about is actually the time to trading. So once a sales trader has brought on a new buy side, every day that goes by is a lost revenue. And it's also potential to lose that customer, for instance. And I would say from a buy side or asset manager perspective, every day that goes by, you're losing out on an opportunity to actually access some liquidity and reduce the friction in whatever trading strategy you're trying to execute on part of a portfolio manager. So when we first started getting network cards, printers, and other peripherals for our PCs, people had to go in and configure device drivers. They had to throw these little switches on the network intercards. And each interface, it seemed, needed to get an expert to have something operational. And then came the magic of plug and play, where now you have something with a USB device, you plug it in, chances are it's going to work. You connect to a printer, it's going to find the right drivers. And all of that is this higher layer of a protocol that actually describes and communicates the interface between the device and the computer. So one of our goals with Fix Orchestra is to actually try to make financial messaging just a bit more plug and play. And realistically, that comes in varying degrees, but that's the ultimate goal, is to try to make things so that they're much easier. So right now, after kind of describing the problem and talking a little bit about what our goal is, we can now just really get more specific about what Orchestra is. And really, there's two aspects of Orchestra. One is you define your service. And here's some innovations that I think are really important for people to understand, is that we've had a repository now since 2004, when Kevin Houston actually wrote a program that read these massive Microsoft Word document and created a file format. Orrin Miller, when he built QuickFix in 2001, did the same thing. He wrote the same kind of program that actually created the original QuickFix data dictionaries. So we've always had some way of representing messages in the fields. But what Orchestra does is go beyond that when it defines the actual service. In addition to fields and messages, which we actually are able to define down to the scenario level. Your order message may look different based on asset class. Your order may look different based on where the ultimate destination is. Likewise, on the execution reports, we already know the execution report really represents 12 different messages. Without the ability to be able to specify down the scenario level, it's very difficult to really understand what the behavior of your counterparty is. And of course, components and groups. One of the innovations that Don added to Fix Orchestra was we now can have scenarios at the components level. Your instrument fields, the thing that defines what you're trading, can vary by asset class as well, or by destination venue. What's the symbology that you're going to use to talk to this counterparty? Are you going to use CDOL? Are you going to use ISIN? Are you going to use the Bloomberg Figgy? And so all of that now can be specified in when you define your service. What order types are available specifically? And those we now call our enumerations code sets. And you can actually have scenario-based values of, say, exec type or order status type are available for a given scenario. And then a key innovation is being able to specify conditional rules. Largely, most specs say it's required or it's not, or you have some kind of English language verbiage to say when something is required. We've actually built something called SCORE, keeping with our music theme, which is a domain-specific language. In keeping with the idea that people aren't going to be able to invest quite a bit of money, the Fix organization has built a number of tools. Some of these tools sit in open source that are available off of GitHub, the Fix Trading Community site. And one of those is our SCORE domain-specific language, the expression language we use to describe when a field is required, to describe when you're going to get a certain response back from a message. Around another key aspect in innovation of Orchestra is to be able to capture workflows. If you send in a new order single, here are the responses that you're going to possibly get back from that new order single, and here's under what conditions you're going to get those back. And then additionally, you can also then move on and actually describe actors in state transition. So when we were first developing, this is a few years ago, Don was working, he put the order state matrix into an Orchestra file, and doing that in a machine readable format we found errors actually in the 4.3, the 4.4, and the FIX50 SP2 documentation that really didn't match what was there. Again, having something machine readable that can be viewed or can eliminate and discover many errors. So that's just one aspect and one side of Orchestra. But the other side is important is in terms of how you deploy the service. What version of Fix are you providing to your customer? What Fix ATDL file is associated with a particular connection? What's your encoding layer? There's now 7 different ways you can encode the Fix. Are you using tag value? Are you using simple binary encoding? And at the session layer, are you using Fix? And which version? Are you using Fix-T, Fix4? Are you using Fix.4.2? Those are our new session profiles as part of our refactored Fix specification. Identify your counterparty identification and security. So exchange of keys. What transport layer are you using? UDP, TCP, IP, and then all the connection details, the port numbers and that. So Orchestra really represents things. One is, define your service. And the second thing is, here's how you deploy the service. Now, the key about the deployment of the service is we've tried to make something that's in a very usable, simple format that can be the data, or what we like to call the metadata, that you use to configure your system. We don't view that firms would be changing their Fix engines, but they might be writing some scripts in a DevOps scenario to use the information from Orchestra to do the deployment and configuration, with the ultimate goal of having Orchestra enable and bring DevOps to the Fix ecosystem, where you can use Orchestra from development through testing, quality assurance, onboarding, certification, provisioning, and operations. So the full life cycle can benefit from this Orchestra file in a manner that we hope will not require you to do significant investment or make major changes in your infrastructure, which we realize are probably not going to be possible.
So Orchestra is a standard. It's a standard for exchanging machine-readable rules of engagement. And that includes the message structures, the workflow, the interfaces, including the protocols, and the session configuration. It describes your service offering, and we could deliver the standard, is how we deliver the standard of Fix. Now, so we have a new concept called Fix Latest, and we're really trying to eliminate all the versioning issues that we had in the past with Fix. From Fix 4.2 to Fix 4.4, we had breaking changes, and then we had some more configuration and going to Fix 5.0 and Fix-T. Now, we found that people are mixing message types from different versions of Fix anyways, and so we've opened it up to say, now we're just going to issue the Fix standard as the latest version that includes all the message definitions and what is current, and that's what Fix Latest is. But we can also deliver a file, an Orchestra file, that defines what the messages are in the session layer or any other protocol as well.
Yeah, and I think what's important here is that likely you're going to need to be able to have your systems ingest Orchestra, because that's how we deliver the standard now. We deliver the standard in an Orchestra format. And we're fortunate that Hanno Klein, the Global Technical Committee co-chair from EMEA, who really leads up the GTC, will be talking about Fix Latest more in detail on what that is as a version of Fix. But it's also important to know what Fix Orchestra is not. It's not a product, and there's some confusion. It is a standard for message specification, and it's not a wire protocol. It's separate from that. And the other thing that I think is important is Orchestra is not a replacement for your existing infrastructure. It's a complement to it, and it's not a Fix version. So there's some confusion because we provided a great deal of software to support Orchestra to enable. Our view was there's just some things that make sense to provide to both buy side, sell sides, but also to their vendors and to the trading venues to make adoption of Fix Orchestra much easier for the benefit of the overall Fix trading community. And so there's 2 formats of ways you can represent Orchestra. And we struggled for years editing these specifications, and we had many discussions technically about, well, do we use JSON? Do we use XML? Do we use YAML? Or do we use the new semantic representation? So all these discussions went on the technical side. We opted to stay with XML after actually polling many of the larger firms, when we talked to actual people who were operating, they said, look, we know how to deal with XML. And so really, we discovered within the last year that we could use something called Markdown. It's a simple text representation of documentation. And the example, the version of Markdown we've chosen is called GitHub Markdown, which creates something that's very human writable. Anybody can write and use this simple text format. It's human readable. It's very simple. But with the tablature version, what we're calling tablature, it's a representation of Orchestra. That's something that you don't have to be a technical person to sit there and write a tablature spec. It makes simple tools. But the key thing here is both formats are machine readable, and both formats are interchangeable by our Markdown to Orchestra and our Orchestra to Markdown tools. So you could have somebody simply write in tablature what they want the spec to be, run it through the interpreter, and then you have your XML file. So our view is we wanted to bury whatever that lowest level of machine readability so that people didn't have to deal with it at that level. And what we wanted to do is then show, we can show an example of this actually. On the left, what you see there is the Orchestra XML file. And this happens to be a case study we're doing for the Georgian Stock Exchange. And you can see their new order message. On the right, you can see that same message represented in Markdown on GitHub. One of the powerful features of Markdown is it's the native language of many web-based applications, including GitHub. So if you write your spec in Markdown, you have a tool that will generate the XML so you don't have to deal with that part. And the second thing is you have implicit version control. And you can then integrate this into continuous development, continuous integration environment, and continuous deployment environment, all within a very simple interface to work with. When we discovered that we could actually use Markdown for this purpose, internally for us, it was really revolutionary. So much so that Hanno and Don have actually moved all of our specifications into Markdown. We just refactored the fixed session layer. There's a fixed session layer Orchestra file. We use that and some Markdown text, and we actually generate output in both fixed format and ISO format, just to give you an example.
Just to clarify, what you're seeing on the right-hand panel there is actually a web page generated from or rendered from the Markdown, and that's in GitHub format. So the point is that if you're not familiar with Markdown, you may have used it without even realizing it. Many user forums on websites and so forth use Markdown as their input. And the main point about it is just text. You just type content. You concentrate on content rather than more so than the format. And I think that's really revelation for us in writing specs. So if you want to put a heading in Markdown, you just put a hash sign in front of it. And if you put one hash sign, it's a top level heading. If you put two hash signs, it's a second level heading, etc. If you want to emphasize something, you put asterisks around it or double asterisks to make it bold. It's just a very simple way to mostly concentrate on text, but have just enough of the formatting to be useful.
Yeah. And this midsection here is a very simple table format, much easier than Microsoft Word tables, by the way. But the way the Markdown to Orchestra tool works is that you can actually add as many extra columns as you want. It doesn't matter what order you put your columns in. And the tool actually finds those based on the headings. And we also capture all the supplemental information. Let's say you have some specific, an API mapping for your specification that you want to use internally. You could actually add that as a column in Markdown. And we actually capture and preserve that information in the Orchestra file on your behalf. And that works in a round trip scenario where you can not only go from Markdown to Orchestra, you can bring Orchestra back into Markdown. So you can just move back and forth between the two. But you can also, within your specification, add as much content as you want. Anything else that you add into that document actually is just captured as part of the overall thing. We look for certain keywords like the word message and type, and then also the column heading. So it's proven to be just an incredibly powerful and flexible way to write a specification easily and simply, but then you get all the benefits of, you can version control this file into your own private Git repositories or other version controls, and then trigger continuous integration actions off of any of the common continuous integration tools right off of your spec. And so at the end of the day, what we hope to achieve is that with Fix Orchestra file, you can simply exchange orchestra files with your counterparty, use that to configure your sessions. You can use it to generate documentation. We've also done some trial work, and people will immediately pick up on this, is that you can easily generate code. I'm not trying to specify any particular vendor solution over another, but for instance, you could develop in a continuous integration environment, updating your Markdown file, run it through Markdown to Orchestra, run it Orchestra to QuickFix, and actually rebuild data dictionaries all in one step and have that all done automatically for you. And by the way, the ability to do that is, we're talking a couple hours time. We're not talking a 2-week development project or a 6-month development project. And then we're hoping that the broader vendor community and so forth will actually start to use this to do things like generate test cases. We already know some of our key vendors that are members of Fix who already rely on things like the unified repository to generate test cases. With the rich conditional rules, with the workflows and behaviors captured in Orchestra, the amount of test automation and onboarding automation you can do is quite astounding. This really enables it, so that we hope that through all that process over time, we get more to that plug and play mode, and hopefully increase the value proposition and protect the Fix protocol for the next generation of users. So how can you use Orchestra? I think the key is you could benefit right now just by simply looking at a simpler way to create a richer and less ambiguous rules of engagement document that's fairly standardized across other users. You could use it to understand your own document and document your own internal electronic trading structure. Many times I've worked in environments where our internal environments are so complex between multiple systems, smart order routers, and things of that nature, that using it just to provide your own internal documentation and help to do your own internal continuous integration and deployment is valuable. And you don't need to do the whole thing. It's like any modeling tool. If you just want to capture your message definitions and describe conditional fields, you can do that. If you want to go a little bit further and describe the actual responses to each messages and describe those messages down to scenario level and capture some basic state information, you can do that as well. Do you want to go on and build the full model and detail of your Fix service so that you can get further benefits of automation? And you can do that. So the key thing is we can do it, so we should start doing it today. So I want to go through one real quick scenario of ways. So let's say you have log files. If you have log files, you could use our log to Orchestra tool and the log to Orchestra will actually read all the log files, and based on what information's there, it will generate you an orchestra.xml file that you can then download. If, for instance, you have a quick fix data dictionary, with many people do, you could actually take that quick fix data dictionary, we'll actually add enriched data from the Orchestra Fix latest repository and create your Orchestra rules of engagement from that. If you have a unified, yeah, good.
Then we also have the reverse out there already.
Yeah, and that's an important output is that
generate quick fix data dictionary.
Yeah. So on the output side, if you were to create an Orchestra file now, you could actually generate your quick fix data dictionary. And what we're hoping to do is have our vendor community actually make it so that you can ingest, they could read the Orchestra file, and then they could generate the output into their own data dictionary formats. Again, which is really a very low cost, inexpensive thing to do because it's on the outside of the system. Were we to say, oh, you need to use Orchestra as the core for your engine, that's never going to happen. But if you tell somebody, look, here's this Orchestra format, why don't you read it and generate your internal configuration files, your own routing, your own XML files, your data dictionary files, that's something that's doable and doesn't require a big budget outlay. If you want to start from scratch, you can go in and actually select from Fix Latest, which has all 160 messages, all 5,000 fields that are part of the Fix standard, and all our hundreds and hundreds of components. Select what you want out of that 5,000, select the 200 tags and the 5 messages you're using, and create your own Orchestra file that way, just by clicking and choosing. Or a little more work, but it's not too bad, is that a tool that we use quite a bit internally for our own generation of this specification, we now, by the work of what Hanno's doing, is when we have the fixed lattice orchestra dictionary, we run it through some tools and actually output it in HTML format that goes onto the main Fix website. You could use Pandoc to take your PDF or Word document, convert it to Markdown, edit it, and then you can take tablature as a path to create your. So there's multiple ways that you can actually start today to realize an orchestra spec without having to have someone just sit there and type it in. So we just wanted to show briefly, we decided against the live demo, but we're going to have more webinars in the future and more hands-on sessions where we can actually run live. This is the Fix Log to Orchestra tool. Now, there are a number of constraints when we built the Fix Log to Orchestra tool. One being that we believe that the service has to run through corporate firewalls. Number two, because of compliance reasons, no one's going to allow a log file to leave their premises. So Fix Log to Orchestra runs fully in your web browser at your site. It does all the parsing within the web browser and delivers your file without any data leaving your environment. And so this now is ready for us to start bringing in users to actually start using this in advance. And in another breakout session, we can actually run this and actually demonstrate how it works. And so we were going to do that today, but we were a bit concerned about time. So there's a group of tooling that's been created to support Orchestra, and sort of what we view is we want to be a catalyst to start our community building and adopting and integrating. We're not there to replace the vendor community. We're there to make their jobs hopefully better and help them provide a better quality service to the Fix trading community. We talked about Log to Orchestra. One of the things we really found out, if you work at the tablature level, which is Markdown, there's a bunch of open source editors that are available for you to edit with that. One of the things we're going to add is ability, if you have an orchestra file, you'll be able to produce your own private version of FIXinar if you're a Fix member. And then there's a series of tools that convert between Orchestra, the interface definition, between Quick Fix, between other formats. And we also have another utility that generates an HTML documentation that's complete with workflow diagrams and state diagrams. So sort of to summarize, what we want to do is we really want to support more innovation in a much more affordable way. And so just some of the ideas we hope are running through some of your minds now is we'd really like to see people use Orchestra to generate and run conformance tests. One of the things we're going to be doing in 2021 is actually when we make a recommended practice, we're going to produce an orchestra file, and members of the community can exchange their best practices in an orchestra format, which eliminates ambiguities, confusions, and omissions. And then you can also use Orchestra internally. So much of the complex order flow is within an organization, not across organizations. It's important because you can fully use Orchestra to describe the behavior of a system in terms of states and message flows. So it's something that people could use to generate an emulator, for instance, for testing. You know, during development, you need something to test against. It doesn't take that much work for our broader community to actually write emulators or testing. And then once you have your specification, you can take the same orchestra file and use it to analyze fix logs or fix message flows for conformance. Now, you know, one of the visions that John Greenan was always, he wanted it so that you could actually modify and generate execution management system behavior based on the orchestra file, order management system, smart order routing, and order matching behavior. It's a very trivial case is to actually take a fixed specification in orchestra with enough state there that you could actually generate matching engines, again, for trading and simulation. But these are things we're not going to be doing in the fixed trading community as far as the technical committee, but these are things that we really hope that the folks out there start to think about. And so the last couple of slides before I turn things over to Maria, I just wanted to point out is that about 6 years ago, Hanno and I worked with the Global Technical Committee and the Global Steering Committee to say, look, for our technical standards, we want to make them more open. We moved our technical standards to GitHub. Anybody can propose a technical standard, and then the work is done by some technical working group. So we felt it important that the benefits of the fixed trading community are getting the best technical minds involved in our standards. Now, to not exacerbate the free rider problem and protect membership, if you want to work at the application layer and the business layer, you need to be a fixed member. but we really wanted our technical standards to be adopted by the broadest number of market participants to increase the value of the fixed trading or the fixed protocols, which we think actually builds the value of the fixed trading community. And in conclusion, what we wanted to do, and we tried to communicate, was, look, Orchestra is a standard for defining an interface. It's an interface definition for service offerings. And very important, one of the major assumptions that we probably haven't enforced enough is that we wanted to make sure, and we tested this using the pillar binary protocols from the NYC, that Fix Orchestra could represent any messaging standard, not just Fix, because we think if people are going to invest money in automation, it needs to do more than Fix. It can't just be specific to Fix tag value. And the second thing, we realized we're constrained. You can't modify internal applications. There's no money. That people view there's too much risk. There's other priorities. And so don't underestimate the value of being able to define your service in this human readable form that's also machine readable, and place that under version control where you can then take advantage of continuous integration and continuous deployment. That's just really valuable. And then we wanted to make it so that you could write simple scripts and use Python and JavaScript or XSLT to actually automate some of this updating of your own internal files without having to rewrite the systems. So those are some of the key points that I wanted to make sure you were left with. And the key thing is you can start today. You don't need to have a grand plan in place. You can start now just by working with Orchestra and starting to build your specification and look for those opportunities tactically to get you to a strategic direction of a much better operational and efficiency. We need your involvement. There's a Fix Orchestra working group that actually governs the standard itself and what's in there. Then there's another group that's being led, and it consists of quite a few of our rich vendor software testing working group, and that's being led by Krishna and Yosef. That group's a dynamic group, and they actually generate requirements that come back into Orchestra and give us a way to communicate that. And the other thing you can do is create your own specification now, and then also help test the open source and the member-based tools and services. So with that, what I'd like to do is turn things back over to Maria to follow up.
Thank you, both of you. Great presentation. I'm now I've got a couple of questions that have come in through the Q&A, which I'll throw to you. And if anyone has any questions they'd like to ask in person, if they can just put their hand up through the screen. The first question is, I wonder if anyone has a similar thing in other message-intensive industries like healthcare.
I don't know of anything else, but what I told for instance, ISO 20022 community is I don't think we're holding any of these ideas proprietary, and I told the ISO 20022 community to borrow prolifically from what we put together here. If there's anything that you think can benefit your community, please by all means do so. And there are, I'm trying to think of the name of the protocol that we were involved in healthcare. SSL7, I think it is. It's an ASN.1 definitions. That could definitely benefit. I don't know if anybody else has done any automation in those areas or not, but we certainly welcome anybody to borrow that. And so, yeah.
There was a question about who's using Orchestra. I typed in a partial answer. One is the Fix organization itself is using Orchestra. And we are publishing it on the Fix website as well as in GitHub. And to add to that, I know that some people are using what we're putting in GitHub because they're entering issues where they found defects in the files and so forth. So there are at least a few users, I don't know how many, who are already using those files for the message definition.
Yeah, they're finding issues with the specification themselves that have been in the Word documents for 15 or 20 years. They're actually reporting those to us now because by using the Orchestra file, they can see those and they access them in a machine readable format. And I do think the key point is that I think the big payoff for the industry is that this is how we publish the Fix specification. And I think people will find value in actually consuming it as well. So thanks.
There was a question in the chat earlier about the mapping between XML and Markdown. Is there loss when there's translation? I could answer that. Now, the tablature applications are open source. They're in GitHub. Everything is under organization Fixed Trading Community, and that one is project is called Tablature. And there's MD to Orchestra, Orchestra to MD. At this point in the development, it translates all the major elements that most people care about without loss. The one, I would say, major area where it is not translating as of yet is in one thing we have in Orchestra and we had in Fix Repository was the whole history of every element. So for a field or message, it said like what version was of Fix was it added in, and it was part of a extension pack. It had the EP number and so forth. Currently, Tablature does not translate that part, and we are considering for the future. One reason we haven't made it do that is we're considering refactoring how that whole history works into something we call provenance.
Yeah, so that's an ongoing discussion between Don and I about how to capture that information. So,
thank you. Well, I've actually got one question which I wanted to ask you, but before I do that, we've got a couple of polls. Sorry, actually, we've got Jim Hunt who actually wants to ask a question. So,
Jim Hunt, trading gurus in the UK. You can probably tell from my accent. A little bird tells me that the lower level protocols, FIXP and FIXSBE, are becoming ISO standards at some point. Probably a question for Jim. How's that process progressing, if at all? Over.
Yeah, thanks, Jim, for the question. Actually, Hano just returned from a holiday, and he's kicked off the work now to take our simple binary encoding and our FIXP protocol and FIXS, which is our Fix over TLS specifications, and submit those for ISO standardization through ISO TC60 SC9. I think SBE and FIXP will be two of the first. ISO has a designation for something called a horizontal technology standard. And we, as you know, we found that there's a lot of interest in simple binary encoding from diverse things as autonomous self-driving vehicles. We're interested in using it for the transactive energy industry, where you can actually have battery banks talking in a market dynamics of whether they want to pull power away out of the grid or put power back into the grids. So that process has started, and it's good to just mention briefly that we submitted the fixed session layer after significantly refactoring and rewriting the specification to become an ISO standard, and that's now been submitted as a draft international standard for 3531 to ISO TC68 SC9, and we're hoping that will broaden the acceptance of Fix both commercially around the globe, and it's become very important for China, as all standards in China now have to become ISO standards. It's important because regulatory communities globally are looking and only using ISO standards for their, so we felt it was an important next step. So thanks for the question. So just the results of the poll. Well, that's good news that at least 2/3 of the crowd, but I do think that the other important part is that we need to have more hands-on sessions and actually workshops for a variety of communities. I think that's an important area and we'll take that to heart, that feedback, and action it. So we'll put up our last poll question. Thanks.
And while this is just coming up, I'll just ask my final question. It seems that Fix Orchestra has the power to harmonize the flexibility and differences in the implementation of the protocol. So what are the next steps that we as the fixed trading community are going to take to actually make that happen?
Well, I think one of the key things that we're going to be doing is that when we moved into post-trade, there was a lot of confusion because we had these large tomes, hundreds of page documents. And when we started to implement deeper and deeper into the post-trade space, people were saying, well, volume 7 says this, and this post-trade document says this, and we interpreted it this way. So I think one of the key things is that we start to publish our recommended practices as a well-defined and unambiguous orchestra file. So a community adopting a new set of functionality, especially in the area of more complex post-trade messages, will have something they can go and use and realize if that entire adoption community implements per that orchestra file, the likelihood of them being able to interoperate successfully is greatly increased. I think the other thing will be to have us continue to do just what we talked about here, was doing the education part so that we can help encourage the vendor community and also those people working on bespoke implementations to adopt Orchestra and be able to use these Orchestra files to eliminate some of the differences. You know, one of the programs that Don wrote that's available to members is one given an Orchestra file from a buy side and an Orchestra file from, let's say, a normalized sell side spec to actually generate the code to actually do automated normalization and translation between two versions. And that's an example of what we hope other people will be doing as well. So thanks for the question.
Thank you. Well, just as we wrap up, and perfect timing, I'd just like to thank Jim and Dom for their time today and for all of you for taking the time to join us. Now, please don't forget to register for the EMEA conference on September the 18th. It is free to join for Fix members and all buy side. And an edited version of this presentation is actually going to be available on the day as part of our on-demand content. And also, Don and Jim will be holding a drop-in surgery through the Fix booth at some point during the afternoon, so you can come and ask any questions directly. And I'd also like to encourage everyone on the call to talk to your technology teams and make sure they're aware of Fix Orchestra. And if any members of your team want to get involved with either most or the Fix Orchestra, contact the Fix Program Office at fixtrading.org, which you should be able to see on the screen. I'd also encourage you to try Orchestra, create your own machine feedable spec and send us any feedback so we can feed that into the development team to keep this moving and improving. And many thanks again, and join us if you can next week when we'll have an update from the Global Technical Committee with Hannah Klein. And thank you and have a great day all.